Hi, I'm Colin Davis. Today I talked for the second time with James P. Driscoll PhD, who is a scholar of Western literature and also of Jungian psychology. I encourage you to check out the first interview with Jim, which I will post the link to in the description. Today we talked about many subjects, and I'm going to list for you a number of the things that we talked about. Transgender activism and its relationship to animus and anima in Jungian psychology, abortion rights, the shadow side of political movements, Ukraine and Russia, Jordan Peterson, personhood and consciousness, the idea of autonomous civilizational complexes, and in the West, that complex being codified in the Western canon, the Jungian movement today, and a number of other interesting subjects. Also, be sure to check out all of Jim's books, which are available on Amazon, and his latest book, The Devil and Dr. Fauci, The Many Faces of Bureaucratic Evil. And we will have a talk about this book in the future. Okay, enjoy the interview. Hi, Jim. Thanks for joining me again.
It's great to be here, Colin.
Jim, we had talked before our Zoom call here about some of the subjects that we would discuss today, and the one up front that we said we would work with was the whole situation with trans activism and the perhaps going into, like I had said that I thought that the exoteric trans activism was, if you wipe away all of the political connotations from it, there is this eternal issue that Jung always talked about with our contrasexual images, and how that every man has a feminine side that needs to be brought into consciousness, and every woman has a masculine side, an animus that needs to be brought into consciousness, and that behind the whole superficial side of this, there is a much deeper, more spiritual, more soulful aspect of masculinity and femininity that we really should be focusing on.
Yes, and it's the psychology, of course, is very complex because Jung focused on the anima and the animus, and much of his writing in this area is focused more on the poles, which are anima and animus, than on the whole spectrum. And I think post-Jung and post-Kinsey, too, one of the interesting things is that Jung never did much with Kinsey, and yet what Kinsey had to say had big implications for anima, animus, and other Jungian conceptions. But Jung had kind of moved beyond anima, animus, and sexuality by that time, which was after World War II. He'd had his first heart attack. He was an old man who was 60 years old or so, and he was focusing more on religion and myth and the nature of the soul than he was on the sexual parts, which are more important in the younger part of life. The way I see it, there is this whole spectrum that Kinsey identified, and people are not only in all parts of the spectrum, they can move around within the spectrum to a degree. But there's the whole question of the trans movement. As a gay activist, I would have something to say about that it seems to me a kind of free rider on the gay movement. It was barely there a few years ago, and I think most gay people, most gay men, perhaps particularly, don't see themselves as part of the same group with the same issues as trans people. Something different. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm opposed to trans rights, or I'm not, and I'm not opposed to people changing their physical sexuality, but I think that needs to be done very, very carefully and thoughtfully. And it's probably a good idea only with a small number of people and not with the number. It's become an industry. And that's a huge problem because an industry then acquires marketing. And that's what we're having now in the schools and so on. We're marketing this idea to children. And anytime we market something, and we particularly be allowed to be marketed in the school, we have to ask whether this particular product, what is the real group that could benefit from it? Mm-hmm. And it really is a small group. It's not everybody. And so, and there's also the question with with children of what's the appropriateness of children being presented with all sorts of information about sexuality when they don't have the feelings that are necessary to understand it. And I remember in my own situation, about 13 years ago, I became very, very ill and with Crohn's disease. And I went from like 178 pounds to 130 pounds.
Wow.
And I was barely functioning. And one of the results was zero sexual interest.
Right.
I would see something, I would remark on the fact that in my normal state, this or that would be very interesting, and I'd have a response, and I'd have no response. Right. Well, that's basically what children are close to that. They don't have the hormones there to have to really know what they're talking about, and they shouldn't be bothered with it. And most societies don't bother the children. They isolate them from that. So I think with the trans thing, this marketing of it is
so it's become a complex, Jim. It's become another one of these sort of semi-autonomous cultural complexes, like all of the other, like the big tech and the pharma and the military industrial. It's just another complex.
That's true. It does have an identity and a considerable amount of psychic energy attached to it, along with quite a bit of money. And remember, there are now thousands of people probably, like that person who she's the first admiral, and
oh yes,
from Pennsylvania, a trans person. They are heavily invested. Their livelihood, their identities, and so on are heavily invested in this thing, as much as Democratic Party operatives or the clergy of the Catholic Church or the people who run Microsoft are invested in those institutions. So it's. I also find it concerning in that it seems to me that it's one of those things that's taking up much more space and energy in the public domain than its significance deserves. Another one that I would point out like that, I'm sure my position is probably unpopular, but it's school shootings.
Okay.
Yes, they are terrible, shocking, and regrettable, but the number of people involved is very, very small, and smaller than in, say, certain diseases that we do nothing about, that have small populations and nobody even knows about, might be killing more people than school shootings are.
It's just another trigger point to get people, just like in the case of a complex, there's a trigger that gets the complex activated, and the complex gets to run. Right. And run away with the individual and get the individual into all kinds of trouble. And it's the same thing with a lot of these, national and international issues. The school shootings thing, it is. I mean, more people probably die in accidents falling down the stairs or whatever than they do.
Yeah, definitely.
But it was the same thing with COVID and with all these things. They're pushed out of proportion to serve a political agenda.
Yes, to serve certain interests that profit. But on the transgender thing, I think from a Jungian perspective and an intellectual perspective, there is something positive about it. In that our sexuality is very complex, and we have every person has the hormones of both sexes acting in different ways and in different degrees, and to just isolate, here we have the men and here we have the women and nothing in between, and these are all alike and those are all alike. That's not an intelligent way of approaching human sexuality, especially if you say, well, these are the women over here, and this is what a woman is, and all of these people must conform to that image, and all of the ones over here must conform to their image. So I think that while I don't like the marketing aspect of the trans movement, its way of provoking people to think and look at things more creatively, perhaps, is actually good.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jim. Because, but if we could, but it seems that okay, just like so many issues with the school shootings or with all kinds of issues where you get this kind of vigor. When these are, you could kind of see them as these are shadow manifestations that are coming into the light, and when they burst out into the light, they come out with all of that repressed energy and immaturity around them. And so it's up to those who understand this at a deeper level to say, hey, everybody, okay, there's this level of things. This is like the McDonald's level, or just the most mainstream superficial level of things. And then there is a deeper level to sexuality and masculine and femininity and how it's represented in culture and personal identity. And Jung dealt with all these things and would have something to say if you presented the situation as an individual or as a social situation to Jung, he would bring you back to the archetypal fundamentals of the situation.
Well, you're right that all of these social uprisings, phenomenon, storms, they have a shadow aspect, and if we're going to understand them, we have to look at the shadow aspect. Well, what is the shadow of the trans movement, for example? Well, I think it's this publicity being, this marketing, the people pursuing careers and prioritizing their careers over the welfare of the people that they deal with and the welfare of society. These are all shadow phenomena.
Narcissism, look at me, I'm different.
Yes, and I think there's a strong shadow component to the trans movement. I also think there's a shadow component to the anti-gun movement. It's a desire to over-control people and have the government too much in control.
That we give the government police powers. We give the government the ability to enforce the collective rules at the barrel of a gun.
Right.
And so the Second Amendment and all of that is a check on that. And it's, I mean, this whole Second Amendment, it's just, for me, it's very easy to see the pro Second Amendment side's case, because all I have to do is look at history, and even just the last 100 or 150 years of all these totalitarian regimes that disarmed the population and then committed genocide. And I look at the level of political maturity going on in this country, and I ask myself, if we just went one or two more clicks to the extreme, could we have that kind of a Stalin or a genocidal type of a thing take over? And it looks like, yeah, it could happen.
Well, the guns are a break, and you have to remember one of the first things that the Nazis did was take everybody's guns. And it was a very interesting question I don't know the answer to, but Jung was Swiss, of course, and he was kind of a typical Swiss in a lot of ways. And Switzerland is very much a gun culture. So I maybe will look that up afterwards if Jung had anything to say about it, if he ever went hunting or anything like this. But that's an interesting biographical thing.
Right.
But everything has a shadow side, and if we're going to look at political movements, it's just like there's a pro and con to everything, and the con is the shadow, and we've got to look at that. And one of the problems with propaganda and with the kind of media we have is an elite in control decides what they think is true and right, and that's the pro, and you don't get to hear the con. Ukraine is another example. You don't get to hear the con on that. Even on Fox, Fox is the same as CNN,
except for maybe Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson is a pretty important exception, and the one con thing. Oh, there's several con things that I think are important, but the one con thing that always aggravates me that I never see mentioned is what are they fighting about? Well, they're fighting about a string of territories along the border of Ukraine and Russia, which traditionally were always part of Russia, which are Russian-speaking, and Russian culture and Russian Orthodox Church, and were never part of Ukraine until they were moved administratively by Khrushchev in the 1950s. And those parts, there was a vote in 14, and those parts voted more than 80% for the pro-Russian candidate, who didn't win. But so how about the people who live in those parts? Don't they have are we going to completely ignore them? And what they want and what they like and what the tradition is. But it's totally ignored. The average U.S. citizen is never told that the people in the Donbass speak Russian, belong to the Russian, not the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and so on.
Yeah, the Westerners don't get.
In effect, they are Ukrainian colonies within the Russian cultural sphere. I've never seen that before, even from Tucker Carlson, but it's true. And the case against them is, well, Putin broke international law. International law is not the Ten Commandments.
No, it's
not
pretty
very clear what it is, and there's no real mechanism of enforcing it. But we don't want to get off on the Ukraine.
But just to cap that real quickly, those territories, from a Russian strategic point of view, Russia is pretty much landlocked and has very limited naval capacities, And if they and a lot of their energy and pipelines and mining and all of that is in that eastern region, and they do have historical claims to it. And if they figure that if they can grab that whole side all the way down to Crimea, and if they can take the whole border of the Black Sea there, then they can control commerce going in and out across, and they can actually, from their point of view, they can checkmate the West that they see as bullies.
Yes. Well, they do need Sevastopol and the Crimea. Otherwise, they don't have effective access to the Black Sea and to the out through there. It's always been a landlocked country or close to it, and that's been one of their big problems.
Yep.
But I think Americans have always been overly negative about Russia and Russians, and probably overly positive about the Chinese. I remember, I think it was Susan Sontag once wrote about that, how it was remarkable that our bias against the Russians and in favor of the Chinese, that neither of them made much sense. But again, we have Russia carries the projection of certain shadow elements for America and the United States, I think, and China doesn't carry it as well.
Yeah, but it's so interesting because when Russia was the Soviet Union, Russia was carrying the golden shadow projections of the political left.
That's right. Although the left wasn't very sympathetic to the Soviet Union after World War II, but before they were, and it's strange. But today the left is really strongly aligned. I mean, we have the interesting phenomenon on the Ukraine. The left is strongly aligned with the Ukrainians, but at the same time, other than the Trump faction, most of the Republicans are as well, and 45 of 50 Republican senators voted to condemn Biden for not sending a bunch of planes to the Ukraine a few weeks ago. But when the shadow comes in, plays, and takes over, and makes certain things for verboten, makes it difficult to discuss or think about the con side of things, then we start making bad judgmental mistakes, and I think that's what's going on here.
Definitely.
We have the shadow playing heavily, and it obscures all sorts of information that we need to make a rational and ethical decision as well.
Yeah, whenever we start mass projecting our collective shadow, or even at the individual level, whenever you start orienting your life around your projections, and even your golden shadow projections where you're mythologizing some utopia or whatever, you're going to trip and fall.
Well, that's an interesting idea that you brought up, the golden shadow, that in a way, ideals can serve as shadows, because if they're false and their purpose is to hide the real motives, then they become a kind of shadow phenomenon. The shadow may not always be dark and black. It can be golden too. But on the other hand, as we talked about previously, the key of dealing with the shadow is always finding out what is really there,
right,
and understanding it, and determining what parts, in terms of the interest of the ego in the self, must be rejected, and what parts can be incorporated, and what parts should be incorporated. There are all three of those things within the shadow. And if we're going to scapegoat it and just dismiss it as evil, we won't understand any of the three. So, I mean, that's a key Jung and Jungian message.
Yeah.
That we've got to open our eyes to the shadow, or turn the flashlight down into the darkness.
But as you know, this is the thing, is that to be self-reflective, and especially as you get older into midlife, and to become more increasingly self-reflective, is of course difficult, but everything worth doing is difficult, and our whole civilization is built by people doing difficult things. And it's not that people can't take an accounting, a basic accounting of their shadow, and come to terms with their most energetic projections. It's that there isn't a cultural, there are not models for this. We don't have heroes, we don't have models and leaders explaining the situation to us.
Well, I think that's an important point. Although I would, in a way, disagree, because I would say Jung, for example, is a model and a leader. Maybe the prime model of the whole last 100 years or so.
Right.
But you're right in that our political and intellectual leaders in general are not doing this. They are over on the side of defending the status quo, or what they regard as the pro, and bearing or denying the con, rather than trying to understand it. Whereas Jung wanted to get the entire picture.
Yeah, and we've talked about this last time. Peterson is I wouldn't call him a full Jungian, but he's got a good slice of his philosophy that is oriented in that direction. And he, even though he doesn't actually speak the Jungian language exactly, he basically is, his basic ideas. Clean your room is basically, right, is take an accounting of your own shadow.
Yeah. I think he's a bit, he represents a phenomenon that's healthy in the culture, and has allowed people to talk and think about things that have been in the shadow. I'm not sure that he's sufficiently deep or stable to become a major figure long term. I think he is maybe a bit more in the celebrity area, but so far he's been very useful, and I certainly liked the way that he exposed some of the problems within Canada with Trudeau and the gender terminology, and forcing people to use certain pronouns, and infringements of fundamental freedoms like that. He's been useful.
And he's such a sharp debater, and he's always bringing everything back to rationality and saying, prove your case. Let's put it right on the table, and he's just with a scalpel cutting things apart. And when our political discourse has become so mushy and so emotional, it's really good to have somebody who's that sharp attacking these subjects.
Yes, well, I also, another thing I like about him is, if you watch his stuff, it's obvious that he's very compassionate.
Yes.
In general, very empathetic.
Yeah.
And that means he can see into the shadow, and I I haven't seen him, at least so far as I remember, get off into heavy negative shadow territory. In other words, carrying the shadow. The way where I see that among conservatives is on the abortion issue. Mm-hmm. They can sound reasonable, even like Dr. Carlson, on an array of other issues, and then when they get on to this one, to pro-life as they call it, they know everything. They own the right, the truth, and they become like the intolerant leftist who are pushing climate change or attacking white supremacy. They adopt the same tones of voice and attitudes and hostility towards their opponents. And they don't even seem to notice that's
especially on the religious side of the conservative movement.
Sorry?
Especially on the religious side of the conservative movement, they become a fundamentalist.
Well, unfortunately, though, in the conservative movement, because of just the dynamics of politics, on this particular issue, they don't have to be religious to be self-righteous, over the top, and so on. It's kind of a litmus test. I suspect you can't get anywhere much in the Republican Party unless you can label yourself as strongly pro-life.
I see.
Not as an in-between person. You certainly can't be pro-choice. And if you raise any questions or about the pro-life thing, then you're seen as soft and you're not a conservative. Well, I don't see how pro-life can be seen as a conservative position when it wasn't a position of the majority of American conservatives up until maybe a few decades ago. I mean, Peggy Goldwater was, I believe she was head of the Planned Parenthood organization in Arizona. That's the senator and Republican nominee in 64's wife. And that's inconceivable today. But also, back in the late 40s and 50s, the U.S. put up abortion mills all over Japan. U.S. Army did. There was no objection to it. The Protestants weren't interested in the issue. But the ecumenical movement came along in the 50s and 60s, and the Catholics used that to bring the Protestants and the Muslims over to their side on the abortion issues. And so gradually they changed their position, but it wasn't originally their position. They sort of became pulled over into the shadow, you might say, when they were more in neutral ground before. But I mean, my point was, it wasn't how could it be a conservative position when none of the conservatives in the country protested, bothered? How could it be a traditional conservative position when none of the conservatives in the country bothered to protest the fact that the United States was setting up abortion mills at taxpayer expenses all over Japan for 10 years?
That's just every whatever political denomination or whatever has its hypocrisies. And but so then what about the current Supreme Court ruling, which to my understanding will return the decision back to the states? Isn't that kind of the best situation?
Well, I can see the good side of that, which is I think it's forcing people to let me rephrase that differently. It could force people to think more deeply about the issues around abortion, which are profound and important issues. What is a person, for example? And as to deciding this at the state level, I guess I wouldn't decide it at the state level, because my way of looking at it is that to be able to tell a woman or a person what to do with and inside their own body on an issue that's not of compelling importance to society itself is something that a government should not have, and something that a democratic governments such as ours, that respects based on respect for the freedom of the individual, should not have. If it has the right to tell people what to do with their own bodies.
You said before the interview, the boundary of the skin would be the stopping point for government, right?
Exactly. And if it's not, where it's not, they're slaves. If you own a slave, you can do what you want with him or her. But slavery's been outlawed in this country. And it's one thing to reject the idea that one man can be slave to another, but we must also reject, and this is perhaps even more important, that the citizens and the individuals can be slaves to any institution, including the government. Mm-hmm. Every individual must be free. And that means, in reference to abortion, that I may think that a woman's decision is wrong. Certainly if a woman was 8 months pregnant and the child appeared the potential of being fully normal and so on, I would personally think that was wrong to have the abortion. But whether the state has the right to tell her that is a different thing. If somebody wants to commit suicide, I may disagree with the circumstances, but it doesn't mean that I have or the state has the right to tell them not to. It also applies to the COVID vaccines. It's a difficult issue. If the vaccines were something that would prevent you from spreading the COVID virus, that would be one case. But that's not the case. The vaccines do not prevent the spread of the COVID virus.
But Jim, even if they did stop the spread of the COVID virus and the government was able to impose their will and force you to take a vaccine, where transpose that right over to the abortion issue, where we say, according to your argument here, and I don't fundamentally, I'm sort of like I'm just like letting the whole thing hang in the balance here. But okay, the government can't force another. The reach of the government stops at an individual's skin. And in other words, before a woman gives birth to a child, then it's hands off. But the thing is that the pro-life people could make the argument, but wait a minute, you're now, by interfering with the birth process, you're getting involved in the proliferation of the species that we all have an interest in the same way that you would say, well, I need to force you to take this vaccine because I have an interest in saving the species from dying of a plague. You could say, well, I have an interest in stopping excessive abortion because I believe in the survival of the species.
Well, it becomes judgmental in many of these cases, and they're full of gray areas. And I like to say on abortion and other issues that there are all sorts of gray areas there, And to kind of paraphrase Lincoln said God must have loved the common people because he created so many of them. And I say God must have loved moral gray areas because he created so many of them. And that's a test for us, if you look at it from a religious view, a way of developing character and judgment and so on.
So the state's situation is actually you're allowing a greater diversity of choice, of decision-making, of thought process, and you're allowing each sort of regional demographic to make their own choices about this very gray area.
Yes, that's true, and you're creating a lot of different debate and situations which encourage people to examine this closely, because so many of these states are going to do things rather differently from each other. So there's a whole array of issues raised out of the shadow, you might say, where they had been, and then there is the issue too of whether or not the Supreme Court really has the right to rule constitutionally on this issue, and or if we wanted to ban abortion, should it not be done with a constitutional amendment, and therefore be fully constitutional? There's that issue, but there's another interesting aspect of it. As I said, what is a person? And my view of a person, or what defines a person, is consciousness, the degree to which it is conscious, and that we can't say that only humans are persons. We have, say, what was her name? The gorilla that learned sign language, and she lived in Palo Alto. And
Harambe, I think.
I'm not sure. She was very, very famous. She died some years ago. But
she's conscious, all right. I mean, I get this backyard here, and there's all these. We're just watching a mother fox and her offspring do all of her mothering and stuff for a couple of hours. And I mean, you just look at other creatures, even lizards. I mean, they're conscious. They have self-reflective awareness so that they can react to the environment.
It's degrees. So
it's degrees.
It's very likely that your dog or my cat, if you have a dog, I have a cat. Well, I notice I have two cats, and their personalities are very different from each other. They're not like two cups of coffee, you know. And so, in all probability, the level of consciousness of anybody's cat or dog, pet cat or dog, is considerably higher than that of an 8-month-old human fetus.
You might be right.
And the ability to process and have complex feelings and make decisions and so on. And after all, you can't really do much in making a decision until you're out of the womb. Then you can decide to point this way or that way and all sorts of things. And you know the difference between you and the world. In the womb, presumably you don't. But this gets you into the area of animal rights.
Exactly.
Now, the Catholic Church's view is you got this immortal soul that God gives, and only humans get this. Not orangutans or foxes or anything else, only humans. And it's a kind of species chauvinism. And there's always the question, what happens if we discover other intelligent beings from another star system? extraterrestrials? Or what happens if we create machines that are in effect conscious, can make decisions and think, can build characters, all of that? I guess I would say in either of those cases, they would have rights, because I see rights as something attended to conscious entities, not something attended to something that has the exact human chromosomes. You know, but that's what I see the other side thinking. They like to say stress science and so on. It's human chromosomes. And no, it's not consciousness. I mean, it's consciousness. It's not chromosomes. It's not genetic. But that takes you back kind of to the trans issue of what's fundamental there. And the chromosomes certainly point most people in one direction or the other. You know, although there are some people in between, but still there's this continuum where consciousness must step in and decide where it wants to be. You know, maybe the hormones are over here, but they liked their mother better than they hated their father, and this and that went on in their life. And in terms of consciousness, that puts them here in the middle, not over there. It's well.
That would be a very small percentage. I mean, it would be it would be one thing if the conversation was truly around the very small percentage of people who are either born somewhat hermaphroditic or who are essentially gay, but then they want to identify this way, and we're talking about somebody's right to identify themselves with clothing. I mean, what we would call cross-dressing before, and and we always said that that's legal, and I mean in our system currently, and a lot of what's around this. This whole issue could be dealt with in a pretty mature way and just looking at the American legal precedent. But as we said before, it's turned into this giant autonomous complex, which is just turning into this huge thing that must be seen, and it must roll over everything it can roll over.
Yeah, it's created an identity.
Yeah.
And
remember the civilizational, that every civilization has its own autonomous God complex, right? What did you call it?
A collective autonomous complex. And that is distinguished from, Jung focuses a great deal on the autonomous complexes within the psyche of his patients and individuals, and the archetypes are you probably could say autonomous complexes, but I'm saying autonomous complexes work within the general sphere of societies and even cultures and civilizations.
Yes.
And he didn't get into that so much. He wasn't that interested in crowd psychology. A writer that does that to some degree, that isn't well known, though I've thought he should be, but he did win the Nobel Prize. His name is Elias Canetti, and one of his books was called Crowds and Power. Okay. And he talks about the psychology of crowds. And I don't think I've read it, but it's been decades. I don't think he uses the term collective autonomous complex, but it's appropriate to what he's talking about within the book Crowds and Power. And this is really important to understand what is going on, not just in totalitarianism, although that was we had a spate of books back in the 50s and 60s on totalitarianism, because our civilization had this great shock World War II, Hitler, the Holocaust. And we had to process that. Mm-hmm. So we had great thinkers like Hannah Arendt with The Origins of Totalitarianism that right. did important work in this area. And when I was in college, everybody knew about Hannah Arendt. I mean, everyone who's outside of STEM and who was either in the humanities or social science. And now nobody seems to, but you could have great benefits if we had better absorbed what she and others have to say about that. We could understand these issues better. We would not be pushing things into the shadow so much. I mean, that's what she pulled.
Right, the banality of evil.
Yeah, she pulled these things out of the shadow and to allow us to understand this psychological phenomenon and sociological phenomenon behind totalitarianism.
Exactly. She showed you that it was a collective unconscious movement that couldn't be placed on one or a group of individuals.
Yeah. She emphasizes the collectivity of it. But Jung, of course, did that too in the 30s. And he had that famous essay on Wotan, where he saw the Nazi movement as kind of a revival of the ancient god, Germanic god Wotan. This was in the 30s, before we knew the full evil of Nazism, but they were very anti-Semitic. I think it was written before Kristallnacht, too. But he was very sharply criticized for writing that and things like it. And so he basically withdrew from that and stopped publicly pulling, although he worked closely with Alan Dulles, who you...
CIA director?
Yeah, the first CIA director, the man who built the CIA the way that J. Edgar Hoover built the FBI, and the way Anthony Fauci built what I call the drug testing, licensing, and marketing complex that runs our healthcare. And Jung worked often and closely with him mostly against communism and its spread in Europe, but also against the Nazis. But he wanted to keep this quiet because he didn't want to deal with the kind of attacks that his being more forthright. It's like you're for us or against us. It's sort of an attitude. Again, something from the shadow. Either you agree with everything we say against Hitler or against Putin or against the Supreme Court or the pro-lifers, or you're just outside the pale. You're disenfranchised as a human being. That kind of
collectivism.
It's a shadow attitude. It's the shadow gone mad. Almost.
It is. This is also my criticism of, so we could say Jung kind of said, I'm going to pull away from the political and just kind of work on this psychological and spiritual here. And I'm also critical of the current day Jungians, and maybe it's part of the fact that I think your generation of Jungians, so you had Jung and his colleagues at the time, Marie-Louise von Franz and Tony Wolff and the people that were around him at the time, and then you had the first generation of Jungians, right? Edward Whitmont and whoever else is in there, and then
Erich Neumann,
and these, and then you have kind of a younger generation with what's his name? But then you have all the Jungians that came up during the 80s and 90s and the men's movement and all of that, right? And you had Michael Meade and Robert Moore and all these kind of Jungians, and you're in that generation. And then now where are the Jungians in my generation, in the Gen X generation, or any new ones in the millennial generation? There's no leadership, and so the movement itself is crashed. And so we don't have any.
That's a good point. There is no, at least I'm not aware, I guess you're not either, aware of any leadership there.
Right.
And leadership sort of dissipated. Very, very strong leader with Jung, a bunch of disciples like von Franz and von Neumann, who are also strong, but not at the level of Jung. And then you go down, it kind of like, you know, the Russian eggs, where maybe you have the Tsar in a big egg, and you open up, and there's Lenin,
Russian dolls,
and there's, you know, that kind of thing going on, getting smaller and smaller. But it's I think the Jungians today, there's quite a lot of them, but they tend to focus on
soft
rather
stuff.
than standing on Jung's shoulders. I like the idea of standing on Jung's shoulders because I think that is what he would have wanted. He wouldn't want us to be down there looking at his feet. He would want us to be on his shoulders so we could see further than he did.
Right.
And that's what I try to do.
Yes.
In my writing. But so much of what's done today is simply let's figure out what Jung said or really meant about this, that, or the other thing. And I would say, like the shadow, it's all right to try to figure out exactly what Jung said about the shadow and what he meant. Mm-hmm. But the shadow is an independent phenomenon. It's a reality. And we have to go beyond that to focus the bulk of our energy on. We can use what Jung learned, but we've got to learn more because there's always more to be learned. So we have to look at the phenomenon itself in detail. An example I use in one of my books is Cézanne, the painter. Painted all of these pictures of Mount Saint something. I can't remember the name, but there's a big difference between the mountain and the paintings. The paintings are his view of that mountain, and what Jung wrote about the shadow is similar. They're like the paintings, and what I would write, or you would write about the shadow, would also be like the paintings. But Cézanne's paintings of Mount Saint Victoire, I think it is, are not definitive. It's like you could paint another picture of it and learn more things about the mountain and so on. Whereas if you're talking about the Mona Lisa, that's it. It's definitive. It's just an image. It's not referencing a reality out there. And you can't really, there's no point really trying to paint another or a better Mona Lisa, but there might be a point in painting a better or different Mount Saint Victoire.
Agreed.
Maybe I'm getting off the subject here.
You're differentiating the map from the territory.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
That's a good point. I'm glad.
So let's keep analyzing the territory. Let's understand what the current maps are. Definitely.
Yeah.
And then let's keep
in my book,
the territory.
I
need a copy of that. Yeah.
Book is Jung's Cartography of the Psyche, and it's his maps of the psyche, and that's what I see is his whole thing as a kind of mapping realities that are out there. And if we have a map, it's a great convenience. We can find things faster.
Yes.
And we can find things that we may altogether miss without the map. but the map isn't the same as looking at a map is not the same as taking a trip and visiting the place.
Right. And this is the issue with a lot of Jungians, but I think it's with all movements that come out of, whether it's Gurdjieff or Yogananda or whatever. It's a lot of focus on what he or she said and worshiping the avatar, and
Yes.
and not a lot of taking that person's work as the beginning of a greater science that we have to continue on.
Yeah, and that's a problem I see with our religions, in that the avatars, the founders, and so on, are all 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, except for Mohammed, of course. But they don't have. We've learned so much since about our reality. The universe is incredibly vast. Not just the Earth. And it extends right down into small things, and cells, and chromosomes, and atoms, and subatomic particles, and so all this a totally different picture of the universe than from what Christ or Buddha had. And so you have this idea of the canon, which I think is a very important idea. The canon is very important to the whole concept of a civilizational collective unconscious complex, because to an important degree, the collective unconscious complex or collective autonomous complex writes or inspires the canon of a civilization. So what is that canon? Well, my view of the many Christians would be, well, it's the Bible, or the Catholic Church, well, it's the Bible and things that it's Thomas Aquinas and so on have been written about the Bible within and approved by the Church since then. But I would say, no, the Bible is one thing within the canon of this complex. The works of Plato and Aristotle are also a hugely important part, but it continues on. The revelations continue on, just like the book of Job is a key revelatory part of the Old Testament, according to you and many others. And then the Gospels are the key, most key in the New Testament. Those two key revelations, key steps in the evolution of the deity, according to you, in those two stories there. But I would say that this continues on, and there are other things in the Renaissance, particularly. Milton's Paradise Lost.
Okay.
And Shakespeare's King Lear.
Right.
Are there with importance, maybe not to the Gospels, but equal in importance to the book of Job, and on into our own time, possibly the Brothers Karamazov. It's another one. So I'm just talking about the biggest peaks in the Himalayas here. You know, there are lots of other things there, but the fact that you have what I would see as crucial revelations of the collective autonomous complex in works like Dante, Paradise Lost, King Lear. I think Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and the Brothers Karamazov indicates this is continuing. This is alive and ongoing, and it has a lot of energy. And I don't think it's died today. We haven't had anything of the level of the Brothers Karamazov in the last 100 years. But the energy is still there, and I think it's the hope of probably most Jungians and people like Jordan Peterson and so on, people like you and me, that we will have what is some revival of the Christian civilization, and I see it more as a revival of a reassertion of this collective autonomous complex that's energized the growth and shaped the growth of our civilization. And another key aspect of it is, which this is another subject completely, but the influence of this complex and Christianity on the development of science and technology. It only developed here. It didn't develop in the Hindu or Buddhist civilizations.
Right.
Within Islam, it's always held up. Oh, Islam was this wonderful scientific civilization, but most of the scientists were and thinkers were Christians or Jews. And what they did was they boomed because they were more tolerant of the Christians and the Jews, Jewish thinkers, than the Catholic Church was in the West at that time. But there are things within this civilization, and particularly characteristics of the collective autonomous complex that powers it, which were the germination and the motivation of the West's development of science and technology, in my view. There are other people who have this idea, and the idea of Western idea of freedom being so freedom and truth. I would say those are tremendously they're essential to the development of science and technology.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing to lay out, where you lay out the Western canon. And you right there, you started with Plato, and then you went down, and then and you explained that the Western canon is much larger than the Bible, and it's this whole thing, and then you merged it into this sort of sub-entity, this technology entity, and how that it's all one big strain, and how we could look at it as an evolving entity and try to tie it together and understand its interconnectivity.
Yes, and I think important figures be a little more detailed. That there's, beyond the New Testament, you run into Augustine.
Yes.
Very crucial ideas there.
Right.
You run into Dante. You move on into Shakespeare, Milton, and I think Cervantes. Miguel Cervantes in Spain. And then possibly Melville in the United States. I'm not sure about that. And I think in our own time.
Carl Jung.
Exactly. But also Einstein and the whole quantum physics movement. And back in the 19th century, Darwin. All of those are key in the unfolding of this collective autonomous complex.
Yeah, that's very. I think that's very well put, and it's a really good idea. And I've not heard anyone actually lay that out as a study, as a discipline before.
And but the most recent one of those to die is actually Jung. Did he die in 61 or 65?
Yeah.
It was in
61.
The early 60s. Einstein died before that, and most of the big characters in physics. But to my knowledge, we haven't had anyone since then. But that's not necessarily alarming. It's only been 60 years, and there were whole centuries that would go by. when we didn't have any figures like that.
Right.
But you need these figures to push things forward. Certainly Einstein and his group and Jung were totally, and Darwin were totally essential to pushing things into where we are now.
Absolutely. And Jim, what do you think about the idea that right now where this complex is becoming, maybe it's becoming permeable so that it can, maybe some things can break off and die and some things can come in, and maybe we're sort of in a gestation place. What about the idea that during this period that there could be a revival of the Gnostic spirit of Christianity?
Well, I think there could be, and there is. The question is its degree of creativity, its affected consequence.
Yeah.
I mean, the New Age stuff is a revival of Gnosticism.
Okay, yeah. You're right.
But,
You're right, it is. And they were doing a lot of projecting and stuff, too.
Yeah, it hasn't produced any major figures, at least that I can think of. Can you think of a major figure that the New Age group has?
I kind of like some of these. Do you know who Bruce Lipton is?
No.
The Biology of Belief.
Okay.
There are some guys that were, I'd say that the New Age movement has crashed, but before the crash in the 90s, early 2000s, you were starting to get these thinkers who were being taken in by the New Age movement, and they were scientists, they were biologists or physicists and stuff.
Well, Gnosticism doesn't tend to produce major thinkers. There are exceptions, which might include Jung. I don't know whether he would. I think he would accept being included there.
Yeah.
Paracelsus and a few people back when were Gnostic.
Well, what if I just defined Gnostic in the most general way as and if I said Christian Gnostic, because I think you can kind of say,
yeah.
you can define it in many ways, but Christian Gnostic would be a Christian believer who emphasizes redemption through personal revelation and seeks personal revelation in life.
Yeah.
And you know, because the doctrinal kind of Christianity or religion is more about just
right.
Morality and boundaries.
Jung would see as a revelation coming from the self.
Exactly. So that's exactly what it is.
And coming from church doctrine, not coming from the group that's outside there, but coming from the self. And that's, of course, important to distinguish that self is an archetype, like the anima, the animus, the shadow, and the ego. And a concern you would have was that this revelation come from the self, not that it come from the shadow. You might, with Hitler, it probably comes from the shadow, or from the anima or animus or some other thing. But it has to come from the self.
Right. I mean, essentially, a Gnostic is a person focused on individuation.
That's right, and they're focused on the archetype of the self, rather than.
They might be mythologizing it and projecting it to a degree.
Yeah. Well, whereas I think more the churchian, the Orthodox Christian, is more focused on the persona.
Yes.
Because that's his relation. Persona is what relates to your social group, and that's the focus there. You got to conform. You got to get along and agree with these other church people, and with the church. In
our lifetimes, we'll never have a situation where people completely disidentify with their persona, but at least if we can start to get more general understanding of these complexes, of these parts of the psyche, and this is a persona-oriented behavior, and this is a self-oriented, individuating behavior, and start to understand that, then you can have your persona and your church identity, but it doesn't take you over.
That you don't see it as me. That the shadow may be talking, but you've got to be aware that what is essentially you is different from the shadow, or the anima, or the persona, whichever archetype you might be dealing with. There are others too, of course. There's the wise person and the parent figures and so on. There's
the mother and father complexes and all of this. Yes.
Yeah. So are we about ready to wind up?
Yeah, I think we're ready. I think we're about ready to wind up. Let me go back to my original. The only other thing I had on here was the monkeypox, and everything else. I think it's
really
pretty much a wrap.
Monkeypox might be interesting if we do something on Fauci.
There we go. Let's save it for a talk on him, and we'll figure out how to approach that. Okay, beautiful. So thank you very much for joining me again today, Jim.